Good evening, everybody. I hope you can see and hear me. Welcome. My name is Mike Scott. I'm the Farm Table Foundation Program Director, and you're here for one dough to make them all, Focaccia, pizza, and ciabatta. So it's a delight to see you here again and see some familiar names, which is fun. Sylvia will join us shortly. She's grabbing a recipe. But Farm Table's Foundation's mission is to build local food culture, and one of the ways we do that is by teaching classes like this. Our restaurant serves very local food from about 25 area farmers, all of it organic, and seeking to support the local economy as best we can as well. As you know, we've had programs and classes for years, and the last 8 of them have been online, and Sylvia, I think, has taught 3 or 4 of them, so it's great to have Sylvia back with us. Some of you probably took some of those, the sourdough baking and piadina. So Sylvia is our board chair, also on the chair of Moses. So she's very involved in local food movement and as a grass-fed beef farmer herself, and has done lots of baking and cooking classes as well. So it's a real honor to have you with us, Sylvia, and we appreciate your presence with us. You want to just take it away and lead us through? Oh, and let me just say a couple words to everybody. You should be on mute, just so background noise isn't bothersome. You can add a question in the chat box. If you hover your mouse down at the lower part of your screen, you can turn your chat on and ask questions, and that's how we'll take questions throughout the class. Sylvia will periodically ask me if there are any to come, and toward the end, we'll have time for questions as well. And I will do my best to get all those to Sylvia, communicated to her. If you want to turn your video on, as you probably all know, in the lower left as well, you can click the little icon that says stop or start video. That's up to you. So thanks again all for being here. And Sylvia, please.
All right. Thank you so much, Mike. This is so much fun to do. I guess I'd like to ask our participants a couple of questions just as we start out so that we kind of get the feel of who's in the Zoom. If you could tell me what city or state or country you happen to be Zooming in from, because that's always a lot of fun. And I guess my second question is, do you bake bread? Are you a bread baker, or is this something new for you? That's a lot of fun to know about too, because it always turns out that we've got at least a couple of really experienced bakers in the group, and they are so helpful sometimes in responding to the questions that come up as we go along. I will make time for questions as we go along. I will be doing some demo right in front of me so that you can see kind of the process that we're going to go through for making the poolish, and then for also making the breads that come from there. And I think there might be somebody out there already that I can hear. You need to mute your screen. Please do that so that there's no confusion as we go along. Thank you so much. All right. So
Sylvia.
I asked a couple of, yes.
Yes, so I report to you here. We've got someone from Yonkers, New York, someone from Northern Iowa, someone from Little Falls, Eau Claire, Dallas, Texas, Amory, Cumberland, Florida, Toronto. Some people have said, I tried baking bread, but I think it's so hard. And another says, I've been trying since COVID,
Okay.
but have much to learn. Another person says they're addicted to pizza dough, so that'll be helpful today.
Oh, good. All right. Well, addiction, well, you know, but pizza dough, that I understand. Okay. So we've got some people who may have experience, others who've tried and have been frustrated by the process. I get it. I've been baking bread for several decades and also offering classes for a little bit over 10 years. I find it fascinating, and I do fail. So if you find yourself baking bread and not succeeding every single time, do not fear, do not lose hope. You do get better. And even if your loaf is not picture perfect, it will probably be delicious. I know that many of the first loaves of bread that I made could be used to brick a building. They were so heavy, they were so flavorless, they were so dense. It was my effort to kind of in the 70s to get into that back to land movement and making bread with lots of seeds and stuff in it. You can do that successfully, but we'll take it a step at a time. First, I'm going to talk about yeast for a second, because Polish, that's P-O-O-L-I-S-H, is in a class of yeast starters that is called a pre-ferment. That means you take some of the dough, some of the flour rather, and some of the yeast, some of the water, and mix them together and allow them to sit and ferment for hours, sometimes days. And then you use that starter in order to inoculate your final dough. So it's called a pre-ferment. And why go through that trouble? Well, as you might know, pre-ferments were the only way people were able to make bread that had yeast in it up until about 1930. In 1930, commercial yeast became widely available. And so people set aside their old skills and their old habits because it was so easy to use commercial yeast. Well, Polish is one type of pre-ferment, and it's a really bubbly, sweet-smelling, really jiggly kind of thing that you use for making ciabatta, focaccia, and a high-rise pizza dough. This is not going to make a thin crust, but it will make a high-rise pizza dough. So what other kind of pre-ferments are there? One that you're probably quite familiar with is, because it's all the rage right now during COVID, is sourdough. And sourdough is an effort that is a bread baking strategy that requires that you capture the yeast from the air and on your hands and whatever is existing in your kitchen, maybe from fruit. Some people actually squish grapes into their starter as they're beginning to make it. You capture yeast from the air and you cultivate these and you maintain and keep them healthy over time so that you can use this starter to inoculate the rest of the dough and make your bread. One of the interesting things about pre-ferment, whether it's Polish or another form of pre-ferment called abiga, which is a very stiff pre-ferment, and the sourdough, is that because they're allowed to kind of build yeast, the yeast population within the pre-ferment for hours or days at a time, the yeast not only replicate, they actually yield not only carbon dioxide and alcohol, but also different kinds of flavor making ingredients, components to your bread. That's why when you make bread with sourdough or Polish or biga or a sponge, that's another form, you get more flavor, you get more complex flavors. But the thing that you've heard me mention now a couple of times is that it means creating your pre-ferment and actually taking the time to do it, to make it. Usually making it doesn't take very much time. It's allowing then time to work on your pre-ferment so that it's ready for you to make your bread. Fortunately with Polish, you can use it as quickly as 4 hours after you make it. You set it aside and you let it kind of ferment on its own for 4 hours. Or after that 4 hour period, you can stick it in your fridge and keep it there for up to 3 days so that you can schedule that bread making experience for when you want it. And fortunately, it doesn't take the time or the maintenance that a sourdough does. So let's take a look at what a pre-ferment called Polish gets us. You can make, as I said, focaccia. You can make ciabatta. You can make a high-rise pizza dough. And in front of me right now, underneath this clear plastic bowl is some, it's a pre-ferment, it's a full dough that's been allowed to rise, its first rise. And we're going to make focaccia with it. Now I'm just going to lift this bowl so you can see what this thing looks like. It might be difficult to see it from here. That's why I am including a little slideshow that's going to make it easier for you to see. But what we've got here is a large slab of dough. And you can see striations in it. And those striations or strands are gluten. That's what holds that dough together so that when the yeast gives off its carbon dioxide, the dough can hold that carbon dioxide in and you get the rise in your bread. But let's start at the beginning. How do you make a pouliche? Well, hopefully all of you received the recipes that were given out in your email. But if not, don't worry, we'll start at the beginning. And what we're going to do is actually make a pouliche from scratch. So how do you do that? Well, you've got the recipes, and I'm going to refer to mine. Even though I've been doing this for like a zillion years, I always try to take a look at it because it's amazing how much you can forget, especially when you're on a Zoom. Okay, we've got our bowl. I'm going to put into this bowl, if you take a look at your recipe, I'm going to put into this 320 grams of bread flour. Okay, so you're saying, what? Grams? I don't deal in grams. Well, the recipe also includes the equivalent in ounces and in cups. Why do I use grams? Well, because it's more precise. And bread making is a much more precise activity than cooking is. It's what bakers use all around the world. Grams allow for more precise measurement because there are 28.35 grams to every ounce. So if you need to do a fraction of an ounce, it sure is a heck of a lot easier to do it in grams. So I'm going to use grams. If you've got cup measurements with you, fine. If you've got a digital scale and want to keep 2 ounces, feel free to do that. But what I'm going to do now is just pull over to my digital scale. Turn it on. This is the kind of digital scale that does ounces as well as grams. You can use both, either or. I've got it set to grams, and I'm going to measure out 320 grams of bread flour. Now, does everybody know that there is a difference between bread flour and all-purpose flour and cake flour and pastry flour? They're not all the same. And the way that they differ from one another is in how much protein they have in them. And that protein usually translates to more gluten capability. So a bread flour is also called a strong flour, has a lot of gluten in it. All-purpose flour has less. Cake flour has the least, and in between there is pastry flour. Why does cake flour have less protein? Well, they make it from different kinds of wheat. But the reason why you want a low protein wheat in cake flour is because you want that cake to be light and tender. And when you have a lot of protein, what you've got is the ability to have strong, chewy bread and crust. And so there's the difference. Okay, 320 grams. All right. Put that in our bowl. Now, we're going to add the yeast. But let me ask you this. Do you have instant yeast or cake yeast or active dry yeast? Because all of those need to be treated differently. For example, and why is that? So here's a jar of active dry yeast. Now you're familiar with the little packets. Well, I buy yeast by the pound and 2-pound packages because I go through a lot of yeast as I make breads and have classes. So this is active dry yeast. I'm just going to reach over now. And my tiny little capability storage yet of instant yeast, which is the yeast I use most often. So what's the difference? They're both yeast, they're both commercial yeast. The instant yeast is a much smaller grain, granular size, and every spoonful of instant yeast has 25% more yeast cells in it than the active dry yeast. Because of that smaller granular size and because of the greater activity of yeast in instant yeast, you can do something with instant yeast that you usually can't do with active dry yeast, and I'll show you what. With instant yeast, you can actually add it directly to your dry flour. 1/4 teaspoon. There you go. You cannot do that with active dry yeast. With active dry yeast, you must combine it with some of the water that you'll be using for the pre-ferment. Allow it to kind of rehydrate for 5 to 10 minutes, and then you add it to your recipe of whatever kind it is. So right now you have a recipe for both ciabatta and focaccia that calls for instant dry yeast, instant. If you have active dry yeast, so the recipe calls for instant yeast. If you have active dry, you have to add about 1/3 more of your active dry yeast to make your poolish. At the end of this class, and when you get your thank you email, you will get a new sheet as well that talks about yeast and how they compare and how you can use them in your recipes. So never fear, you'll be able to do this. Okay, so I added my instant yeast to this. And now I have to add 1.5 cups of water. Excuse me while I go get it. Thank you for that. So here, I've got 1.5 cups of water. And what do we know about yeast? Yeast is sensitive to temperature. You do not want to add water that is too hot, or you will kill your yeast. So make sure that your water is under 90 degrees. Room temperature is best. And in case you may not know this, most cookbooks assume that you're cooking in a kitchen that is between 72 and 75 degrees. So if things don't happen as fast as things are forecast in your cookbook, it may be that your kitchen is cooler and you just have to allow more time. So here we have the flour, the bread flour, in my instance, the instant yeast, and 1.5 cups of water. And then we mix vigorously. There we go. If any of you are kind of baking along with me, this is going to take about a minute or two to get that flour fully hydrated so that you don't have dry clumps in it. You don't want that. All right. It does take a bit. All right. Very good. I'm going to grab now something to put over this bowl so that it can now sit for 4 hours. I could use it in my baking after 4 hours, or I could store it in the refrigerator for up to 3 days. Now, I've mixed this up, and I was making the poolish. That's a 4-hour poolish. In your materials, you also have a recipe for a 12-hour poolish. The 4-hour poolish uses a 1/4 teaspoon of yeast if you're using instant yeast, a bit more if you're using the active dry yeast. The 12-hour poolish uses only 1/8 teaspoon. So if you're struggling for yeast, you might want to try the 12-hour one because you have to use so much less. All right. There we go. Now, I'm going to cover this. And what I'm going to use is actually a food grade, what looks like shower cap. You can get these at any grocery store. Here for putting over bowls. Now this was a 4-hour poolish. You could just as easily have used a 12-hour poolish. So what does this look like then after those 4 hours or after the 12 hours? Well, I'm going to bring over a bowl so that you can see that as well. And if you don't have a really great picture of this, don't worry too much. The slideshow is going to have a better shot. But pretty much, we're talking about loads and loads and loads of bubbles. This is a really active poolish at the end of, oh, it smells so good, 4 and 5 hours. And we're going to use that to make our dough. So how do we do that? Let's take that next step. You've got your ripe, they call it a ripe poolish. We've got our stand mixer, our stand bowl. And I've got to tell you, although ciabatta and focaccia and the pizza are considered artisan breads, they are not antique recipes. They are children of the 60s and 70s. These focaccia and ciabatta are fairly new to the scene. So don't be afraid to depart from the usual hearth bread kind of approach and use whatever mechanics you need to get the job done. You can certainly make this in a food processor, I am told, although I've never done it. But I rely on my stand mixer a lot for making focaccia and ciabatta because it takes a lot of mixing. So here we've got a ripe poolish. We need to now get it into the bowl of our stand mixer. And this step requires 3/4 cups of water, additional yeast, more flour, and a poolish. So I'm going to grab 3/4 cups of water. There we go.
So,
Yep.
well,
Question.
we got a question, and I think you've answered it in some ways, but perhaps you want to elaborate. The question is, can you make this if you don't have a stand mixer? And how would
Yes.
you do that?
Yes, you can. All you do is, instead of using a stand mixer to mix your dough, you're going to be mixing by hand with a spoon. And just probably mixing for a good 8, 9, 10 minutes. Because even with the stand mixer goes for 7 minutes. So this requires a bit of muscle, but certainly you can do it. Absolutely you can do it. Okay, here's my 3/4 cups of water. Here's my poolish. This is a really jiggly, very loose kind of batter. And if I was to just dump it into my bowl of the stand mixer right now, a lot of it would stay in the bowl, just clinging to the sides. One trick that you can use in order to separate the dough from the sides of your bowl is to take your water, the water that you're going to use for your recipe, and actually dribble it along the outside edges of the bowl. There went my 3/4 cups of water. Then, to help things along a little bit, you just kind of sculpt along the outside edge as well. You can use a spoon, you can use a spatula, whatever you've got handy. And then I just dump it into the stand mixer. And it all comes out cleanly. There's a little bit stuck onto the side, which is, kind of natural. But most of it made its way into the mixing bowl. All right. Great. Okay. Our poolish, the water. Now we have to add additional yeast. Okay. Because we're all suffering from yeast shortages, in preparing for this class, I actually made several batches of bread and used different amounts of yeast in an effort to see how little yeast could I actually use and still produce bread that wouldn't take forever to make. Because even if you used a very tiny bit of yeast in addition right now, it would work. But because there's a very little yeast, your fermentation time would take much longer, hours longer. Given the recipes that you received, the instant yeast that I would now add at this point would be 1.5 teaspoons. That's a lot of yeast, especially now when we're all having difficulty finding yeast. If I've got active dry yeast, I would add 2 teaspoons. So I'm sort of giving you kind of the equivalents that you might use if you've got active dry yeast instead of instant yeast. But I actually tried a dough that instead of using 1.5 teaspoons at this juncture of instant yeast, I only added 0.5 teaspoon and did a trial to see how much longer does this bread take to make. And I found that it only took an hour longer in the first rise and only about 15 minutes longer in the second. So you could really cut back on some of your yeast if you're willing to take longer for the rises to happen. So kind of work with what you've got in it and play with it a little bit. I didn't know how that was going to turn out. I sort of knew, having baked for a long time, and how it is that yeast works in wet dough, but it proves it out. At this point, I think what I'm going to do is actually use up the last of my instant yeast. I've got a teaspoon. And I'll just work with it. All right. And then I also have to add another, let's see, I think it's 340 grams of flour. So I'm going to go back to my scale, digital scale. Measure out 340 grams. There. And add this to the bowl. Now at this point, even though I've got a stand mixer, one of the things that I tend to do is try to do an initial mix with a spoon, just to prevent a lot of flour flying out of the mixing bowl at this point. So I just do it for a while. Just to get some of it pretty well kind of incorporated. I'm not trying to do a thorough mixing at this point. I'm just trying to make sure things don't start flying when I turn this on. Okay, this is going to go to the mixer, but I'll tell you, you don't want to hear that mixer going on while we're doing this Zoom class. Way too much noise. So I think what we'll do now is we're going to go to my slideshow. The slideshow is pretty short, so don't worry about that. And it includes, however, a really quick 5-minute video. And it's during that 5-minute video that I'll get the stand mixer working so that you don't have to listen to that buzz. Okay. I keep on losing my, oh, here it's my mouse. Okay, so let's go to that slideshow. All right, here we've got it. And again, thank you for the partnership with the Farm Table Foundation for making this happen. It's just fun. Okay, so one dough and many variations. In fact, I've got down there that it's endless variation, and it's true. Because any focaccia that you make, oh my goodness, it can be savory, it can be sweet. Your ciabatta can be plain, it can have all kinds of herbs in it. It can have green olives, black olives, ham and cheese. Really, this kind of dough is a canvas for you to play with. Here's what that pre-ferment looks like after it's ripened. You see all those great bubbles. And the pre-ferment, as it says right here, it's just a combination of yeast, water, flour, and thyme. And it's all about getting better flavors. And it is an approach that was said to have come, well, not just to England, but actually to France, from Poland in the mid-1800s. Although I've read reports from Austria. So this is what you can get with it. On the left, you've got your nice puffy ciabatta. On your upper right, you've got your high-rise pizza, which, you know, it's really kind of like a focaccia. And on your lower right, what you've got is a sweet focaccia with sauteed pears and rosemary oil. So all of these doughs have the same basic formula and a very high hydration dough, up to 75% water by weight, by total weight of the dough. That's how you figure out how the duration, how you express it. You've got a certain weight of flour. Let's say you had 2 pounds of flour. Then you'd have 75% of that weight is water. That's how you figure out those percentages. And the differences amongst those breads is really how you decide to shape the dough. And these are the basic steps. Pretty simple. Now, I've talked about having a digital scale and about having a stand mixer. One of the other things I just can't seem to bake without is parchment paper. It just makes not only cleanup, but it makes moving dough around if you have to get it from a kitchen counter to a peel to the oven. It just makes life so easy. All right. And this is how you get to ciabatta, roughly. So in the bottom right, what you've got is the rough dough after it has risen for a couple of hours. In the upper right, there you've got your raw ciabatta load rising on a very heavily floured, either canvas or linen or kitchen towel, tight weave. And then on the left, you've got your ciabatta ready to go into the oven. And that's what you get once it's done. And I've got some examples here that we can actually look at and actually knife through so we can see what the internal structure is like. And here are examples of focaccia. On the right, you've got 2 different types of savory. And on the left, you've got a raw focaccia that's covered with pears, thinly sliced pears that have been, I guess, tossed in olive oil and other flavorful herbs, including rosemary. Okay, so here we've got this video, and I hope that you enjoy it. Huh. It did not happen. Let's see. There we go. Oh, I think I did something here. I just, here we go.
Sylvia,
Yeah,
is there supposed to be sound on this video?
no, no,
Okay.
it's pretty silent. If you hear anything at all, it's just the stirring. Like right now, there's not a music and there's no narrative.
Okay. So if you're planning, just by the way, if you're planning on using your mixer, you'll probably want to mute yourself while this is going on then.
That's what I was trying to do, and I could not find a way to do it.
I'll try and see if I can do that for you.
That would be terrific.
Okay, you're muted, Sylvia.
right. Oh, you can hear the final.
You're unmuted now, Sylvia.
Okay, thanks. You can hear the stand mixer going,
Yep.
and we're done now. Whew. Wow.
Sylvia, we did
So,
get one question during the video.
sure.
It looked like you were stretching the dough, not kneading it, would you say?
Yes. This uses a method called stretch and fold. So it is a very wet dough. You would not be able to knead it in the conventional way that you might be used to. It is a very gentle lift and fold, lift and fold. And in fact, we're going to take a look at that right now. So I made I took our pre-ferment that had ripened. I made the dough. All right. We're going to take a look at how to stretch and fold, but I do want to take a look at some of that dough that's already risen.
Sylvia, can you possibly move the dough a little more to your right?
No, because
Okay.
it's really wet. But what I'm
That's
going to
fine.
do is I'm going to take the dough out of the stand mixer. And it is a wet dough. And you can see that it flows. It's beginning, it's like, well, it's flowing like lava, not like water. It's molasses in January, but it is moving. And what I'm going to do with this dough is actually put it on, as you saw in the video, a very heavily floured surface. And I'm just using my hand. You could use a scraper if you have one to pull this dough, which is super sticky here. You can see it kind of globbing out.
And Sylvia, do you use the paddle instead of bread hook because of the wetness of the dough? Or
No,
rather,
I use the dough hook. I do use the dough hook instead of the paddle. Even though it is this wet, it works much better with the dough hook than it does with the paddle. You would have it's thick enough so that you actually would get so much clumping on the paddle that it would not mix well. Okay, so here's this really sticky, wet dough. And it is sitting on a bed of flour, quite a bit of it. And I'm actually going to put more flour on my hand and show you the initial fold. This stuff is like goo. But even as I make my first fold, you're going to see the structure tighten up and the gluten begin to form. So I stretch. This is a real stretch, and fold. I pick it up and I stretch it and fold. And even with just those two stretches and folds, this dough already has more structure. Look how it pulls together. It's holding itself together now with just 4 folds. It does not look like the goop it was earlier. That was the first stretch and fold. Now I'll cover this with a bowl, or you can use plastic wrap. I tend to use big bowls for this because it it doesn't dirty as much plastic. So let's do that. I'm just going to cover it with a bowl for right now. Usually I use a really big bowl, but it would be in the way. So what does it look like after an hour and a half, 2 hours of all of this? Well, what I've got in front of me, and I think you, Mike, what you're saying is that it's not, you can't see it.
Well, we can see about half of it, Sylvia.
Okay. Is a really big, probably 13-inch in diameter mountain of dough. So this is what it looks like after 2.5 hours or 2 hours of stretching and folding. And you only do that a couple of times. It's not like it takes a lot of it. But you've got a lively, lively dough. And what I'm going to do with this now is actually make the bed for focaccia. I take olive oil, parchment paper, I'm drizzling quite a bit of it onto this parchment paper, up to a 1/4 cup. And then I'm going to take this dough, this humongous piece of dough, which is falling all over itself, and pick it up and place it on the oil. Even in just picking it up, the gluten in it began to tighten up the dough. So I'm going to let it rest 5 minutes before I take the next step. So that's what we did there.
Sylvia, Sandra has asked if you can make any loaves or shaped breads with this dough, or is it too wet, or like a baguette?
You could make a baguette, but it would be a very rough shape. They call it pan ancien. You stretch it for a long shape. You put it into a cloche rather, and I'll demonstrate that right away. Because we've got another bunch of dough that we can work with here. But not a very well-shaped loaf. So this is a more rough kind of shape that you're going to have to this because it is so very, very wet. Yeah, it is a very wet dough. But we can shape ciabatta. And I know time is getting kind of short here. So one of the things I'm going to do is take a look at this. We're going to kind of mimic these steps. We've got this loaf, rather dough sitting here. I'm going to put more oil on it. If you're afraid of oil, this is not the bread to make. And I'm going to dimple the dough. And if you find that the dough is resisting this dimpling, I'm not rolling it, I'm not squishing it, I'm using just the tips of my fingers to dimple it out. If you find that the dough is resisting you, leave it alone, come back in 5 minutes. It will have relaxed enough so that you can continue doing this. But for our purposes today, I'm going to make this a sweet focaccia. And what I've done is I went into my garden, picked a lot of rosemary, lemon balm, catnip, which actually is terrific for humans, believe it or not. And just going to sprinkle it on.
Sylvia, while you're at that, someone has a question about the olive oil.
Yep.
The instructions say add olive oil to the dough when mixing. As you do that as well as just, when you have it in the pan there and on top of it?
That is a choice for you. I don't use it. personally. But if you take a look at any kind of sets of cookbooks around, most of them say, you know, add olive oil. It's up to you. I find that it makes the dough looser, and that the bread does not, and the dough and the focaccia does not rise as well. And that's why I don't use it. And very often for something like this, even with the a sweet dough, I take my olive oil and I may flavor it. I may add a spice to it. I might add nutmeg to it, so that I really get a kind of a breakfast bread kind of profile from this. Okay, so here we've got it, right? We've got our focaccia all laid out. And what we do now is cover it in plastic and allow it to rise for an hour and a half. And at the end of that hour and a half, what we do is dimple it down again. At that point, I would add some large granulated sugar to it if it's a sweet focaccia, or some cracked pepper if it's a savory, and then into the oven it would go. So what does this look like after an hour or 2 hours of rising? Excuse me, I just pushed my phone around. I'll show you, because I've got one that's already done and ready to go into the oven.
And Sylvia, when you're putting flour on your counter, is that bread flour or all-purpose flour on your counter?
It is bread flour.
Thank you.
Good question. All right, so here's the focaccia that I've made. It had risen, and what I did was I stuck it in the fridge so that it would be to delay any more rising. So you can use how much yeast you use. You can use temperature to slow things down. And what I've got here is a savory focaccia. And it's got all kinds of marinated tomatoes in it. And I've got oregano from the garden, lots of salt and pepper. Actually, I needed to add the salt to it. And I add salt at the very end, because sometimes when you add salt at the beginning of the rise process, it actually leaks into the dough. And so I wait till the end. And what I'm actually going to do is use a Maldon finishing salt. No, I decided not to. I'm going to use a Celtic sea salt, the bigger brand.
And do you recommend a certain brand of bread flour, Sylvia?
No. I think what's most important is that the flour is not old. You don't want flour that's more, you don't want to keep flour for more than 6 months in your counters. You don't want to keep it in a really hot spot. The age of the flour actually is more important, but you do want to use bread flour. If you can get organic, please do. I use various kinds of flours. And what you'll find is that each flour performs slightly differently. So if you've actually been using the same flour for a long time and then switched brands, you'll find big differences in how it reacts to water, time, how it reacts to mixing. It's a real eye-opener. So now I'm going to stick this one in the oven. And one of the really neat things about both focaccia and ciabatta, as well as the pizza dough, is that they take almost no time to bake. The ciabatta take a total of 20 minutes. The focaccia is a little bit longer, and but not much. I think it's 18 minutes before you flip it around. Yeah, actually, it's only baking time of of 20 minutes altogether. So they're really quick. They also tend to cool quickly. So you don't have to wait the requisite 2 hours before you slice into them. I wanted to do one more thing before we finish off here, and that is actually shape ciabatta for you. So we've got flour on the surface. Again, this is one of those that requires quite a bit of flour. I've got another big bunch of dough kind of off to the side, out of camera range. I'll bring it in.
And Sylvia, you mentioned a finishing salt earlier. Was it Maldon?
Yes, it was Maldon.
Can you
Maldon
spell that
smoked.
for us?
Spell it M-A-L-D-O-N.
Thank you.
Maldon, and it's an interesting salt. It's quite expensive, so I don't use it for cooking. I use it for finishing a dish. The interesting about Maldon crystals is that they're huge and that they're pyramidal in shape. And so you really don't have to use a lot of it to get a real burst of flavor. It's really a terrific salt. But again, use what you have, use what you want.
And in your chat box there, folks, just FYI, I mentioned Sunrise Flour Mill because we do sell that at Farm Table, and also put the Farm Table restaurant phone number on there and website.
It's a really good flour. It is an excellent flour. I've used it quite a bit. All right, so here we have some dough that has risen quite a bit. And what I'm going to do now is take this and shape my ciabatta. What I've got in front of me right now is a very, very heavy canvas that is totally impregnated with flour. And I often use a flour to rice flour mixture, 50-50, because it's easier to separate the dough from this surface. That rice flour and bread flour mix, I use it an awful lot. So I'm using a bench press. That's what this is. It's like a plastic knife. And I know a lot of people use metal bench presses. I use plastic ones because I'm working on a Formica surface and I don't want to harm the surface. So these work well. And what I do is I'm pressing through the dough to separate it, not sawing back and forth, but pressing it through. And then I'm going to lift up this dough and just, it's a crude shape, and just put it into this floured canvas. And I'm creating little walls of canvas around each loaf so that it can rise with a little bit of shaping. Here's my second piece of dough. I'm stretching it to about 10 inches. And I'm just putting it into this linen cloche. Actually, it's a couche. And I'm taking it, a corner of it, and just resting it over these just formed loaves. They'll rise there for 45 to 60 minutes. And then they'll be ready to go into the oven. So at the end of all this, what do you end up with? Hold on a second. Another tool that I find indispensable is my little digital timer. I almost forgot that I had the focaccia in the oven, but I could smell it. It smells really good. All right, let me grab a couple of loaves.
Could we scale the dough to make ciabatta buns? How many would it make? And is that the only way to shape the ciabatta?
Pretty much. It's, I mean, you could shape it a little bit, especially if you've got buns, because your hand can shake them a little bit. But you really don't want to work with it too much because you'll deflate the dough. This is a high hydration. Yes, you can make smaller loaves. You can make them bun size. Absolutely. Just cut the dough into smaller pieces. That's all it would take. And it would work beautifully, just beautifully. Okay, so see, these are some of the loaves I made a little bit earlier today. And this one was made using very little yeast and longer rise time. This one was made using the regular amounts of yeast called for in your recipes and the regular rise times. So what I was going to do is cut into these so we can see, hey, did they perform well? The proof is always in the slice, is what a lot of people say. So let me grab my special bread knife.
And Ryan has asked, what type of cloth are you using to put the bread in and cover with?
Okay, this is, believe it or not, this is an old flour sack that I bought at a thrift store. Washed it thoroughly and then heavily impregnated it and just used it. But you can use any kind of sackcloth kitchen towel that you have. Just make sure not to use anything that's a terry cloth, because that the bread will get all gummed into. Okay, so let's slice the bread. Ooh, cold. All right. Haha. I'm happy. All right. As they say, the proof is in the holes. So here we've got a nice loaf with lots of open holes. Great for dipping into olive oil, making muffaletta sandwiches, you know, using with your stews and your soups. Oh, it's got a really good smell to it too.
You do delivery?
Well, actually, I'm going to probably have enough many loaves to do something like that almost.
Like it, yeah.
Okay, so that was the bread that used the conventional recipe. This is the loaf that used very, very little yeast, but took then more time in order to create the finished loaf. An interesting thing about these loaves is that the crust remains very crispy for just a short while. It will become softer with a little bit of time. Well, got great holes in this too. I'm a happy camper. And the smell is just as good. So what are some of the pitfalls in making some of these types of breads? There's my timer. I have oh, here it is. Hold on a second. That means that the focaccia is close to being done. Hold on.
While Sylvia's removing the bread, I just posted on the chat a link to Farm Table's YouTube channel, where tomorrow or soon, this class will be up there in terms of the recording, but all of her previous classes and then recent ones on backyard gardening or backyard poultry raising. So Farm Table now has a YouTube channel with our classes on it.
Oh, wonderful. Well, that little timer told me that we're halfway through the baking, so it's going to be just a few minutes, and then we will be done. So what are the pitfalls? One is allowing your coulis to get old. If it doesn't have lively bubbles on it, if you've left it in the refrigerator for 5, 6 days, it's not going to work. So admit that, oh, I forgot, start again. You don't want to use an old poolish because it simply will not work for your bread. Another thing, if you ferment, if you let the rises of the bread go for too long, either the focaccia or the ciabatta or pizza, it may look nice and bubbly, or it may even look like it's risen to a huge volume. That's not good either, because although the volume may be huge, what you've done or what's happened is that the yeast has consumed all of the sugars from that dough. And what you're likely to get is a very flat tasting bread. A flat tasting bread, and the color will not be good on it. It will not have that nice brown color. Instead, it will kind of take a little bit kind of tan. Other than that, this is an easy dough to make and quite versatile. It doesn't take the kind of forethought and starter maintenance that a sourdough takes, although that's what I tend to bake most of. And it does give you really good flavors, more complex flavors than you would get from just doing a straight dough. And straight dough is the kind of bread, straight bread, that just uses yeast, flour, water, and salt, but doesn't have any kind of time that's left that allows those other flavors to develop. It's kind of interesting, when commercial bakers began using the commercial yeast, they were so in love with the fast action of commercial yeast that they put aside all the pre-ferments and the sourdoughs and everything else, because they could make bread faster and sell it faster. But we lost flavor, and we lost the healthful benefits that come from pre-ferment. The most healthful benefits coming from the sourdough starter. So some of the great flavor that you're going to experience is not just from the yeast, but also from any kind of bacteria that are also cultivated in the bread. And that happens, again, most extensively with sourdough. So I'm just waiting a couple of minutes, and we're going to take out that focaccia so that you can see what we finally got with this poolish. And I'm wondering if there might be any more questions.
Well, we're close to the time, so how long do you let these breads do a final rise? And can you talk about water and steam in the oven?
Thank you very much. Great question. Okay, so with the focaccia, you let it rise after it's been put in the pan. You let it rise for up to 1.5 hours to 2 hours. Okay? Now, again, that depends on how cold your kitchen is. If it's a really cold kitchen, you might have to let it rise a little longer. If you decided to use very, very little yeast, you'll also have to let it go a little longer. With the ciabatta, once it's been shaped, and then I'm going to put it down because it's really hot. All right, so steam in the oven. You don't use it for focaccia. You don't have to steam the oven for focaccia. You do steam the oven for ciabatta. And the way I do it is this. I preheat the oven to 500, and while I'm preheating the oven, I've got a throwaway piece of garbage kind of pan sitting at the very bottom of the oven, on the floor of the oven. And it's there as a receptacle for the water that I'm going to toss into it to create steam. So just before I put my ciabatta into the oven, I pour, I don't know, half a cup of water into that pan, and it just creates this huge cloud of steam. I flip the ciabatta onto my either baking stone or baking steel, and immediately take a spritzer bottle. So you have to have these things ready. and spritz the sides of the oven walls. You don't want to spritz the light or any other kind of component that you might be able to short out. I've done this twice. You don't want to do it. Close the oven, and that's it. That's all the steaming that I do for ciabatta.
All right, so Sylvia, we should probably stop in the next couple minutes.
Yep.
Two other questions came in. What pan do you put the ciabatta in, and what are some of your favorite focaccia toppings combination?
All right. The pan that I'm using, I don't put the focaccia in a pan. I actually roll the dough.
She's asking about the ciabatta.
I'm talking about the ciabatta.
Okay.
I don't put the ciabatta in a pan. I take the loaf, and I actually transfer it to parchment paper. Then I take that parchment paper, I put it on a peel, you know, the things that you use for using for pizza. I put it on the peel and then put it into the oven. So it sits on parchment while it bakes. I don't use a pan. So you don't have to worry about a pan. Some people, instead of using parchment, will heavily use a lot of cornmeal or semolina on the peel and then get it into the oven. I don't like to do that because that semolina and corn burn, and I don't want that flavor on my bread. So I roll this dough onto a piece of parchment paper. Here's my parchment paper. I'll put it next to the risen loaf, like right now. I'll sacrifice this loaf. And I'll carefully lift it up and put it on a peel. And put it on, rather, on the parchment paper. Then I'll use my peel, lift it up, and put this loaf in the oven. And that's how you handle it. One of the two things that I think sometimes people get really kind of, they have to become used to, certainly I did, is that this is a really, really wet dough. Don't be afraid that it stretches, that it's not high and bouncy. You also have to use a lot of flour. So don't be afraid that the loaf itself has a lot of flour on it. Certainly this did, but that's signature of ciabatta. And that's how it works.
So do you do anything different for a pizza?
For a pizza, what I would do is take I would probably take your ciabatta loaf, and I might actually roll it a little bit. And you could use either a sheet pan, or you could use an 8x8 like little cake pan, and make the dough so that it fits right in there. And it will rise. And I think that it'll work very, very successfully. But again, this is not a thin crust pizza. This is a high rise kind of pizza crust. And so as soon as you've rolled it out, you put it into your little pan, you're going to want to put the toppings on it. And you asked me about toppings. For my sweet focaccia, one of the things I love to do is thinly sliced pears or thinly sliced apples. Saute them in butter with a little bit of brown sugar. I put my olive oil on the focaccia. I'll lay the slices of fruit on it, and then I'll sprinkle it with herbs. You saw that I used the lemon balm and the catnip. I'll also probably sprinkle it, this one here, with nutmeg, freshly shaved nutmeg, and demerara sugar, just before putting it into the oven. As far as the savories go, man, anything goes. I love to roast garlic and either put whole cloves on the focaccia or smear it on the focaccia, roasted peppers, well, roasted peppers, marinated dried olives, marinated dried tomatoes, heavy cracked, freshly cracked peppers, freshly cracked salt, oreganos, thyme. You can do whatever you want. That's the beauty of this thing. You can make it what you like.
Great. Well, Sylvia, any final words or thing you want to say?
Yeah, don't be afraid to try it. Again, it may not work the first time, and I invite you to email me if you'd like to continue the conversation. This to me is so much fun. I'm so glad that many of you chose to join us this evening, and I hope that you will have lots of fun and lots of successes baking bread.
Thank you, Sylvia. And where might they reach you? You said through your Facebook page?
You can reach me through Facebook, although I prefer just an email. Please feel free to email me. It's at Sylvia, Sylvia, at bullbrookkeep.com. And I think, Mike, if you share that, I think in the chat box, that would be great.
Yeah, Sylvia at bullbrookkeep.com, and that's the name of Sylvia's farm where she has grass-fed beef as well. So you can find out more about what she does on the website, bullbrookkeep.com as well. Well, lots of thank yous coming in, very informative, great teacher, all those sorts of things, Sylvia. And as always, we certainly
really
appreciate
enjoyed it. Thank you so much for joining me at my farm teaching kitchen.
And I'll be in touch tomorrow with her email address and a copy of the video for the class. And
Had a
thank
little
you,
technical
everybody.
difficulty there. Okay, bye-bye now.
Thank you all. Bye-bye.